Good evening. I'm Dr. Nita. I'm a lecturer in religious studies at the Open University. The Open University has been thrilled to be the knowledge partner for IF Milton Keynes International Festival 2021. And tonight's event marks the end of 9 months of work for what we think has been a unique collaboration between a UK university and a city-based cross-art form festival.
We're social practice artists and we're really committed to making accessible, playful and engaging work. We're really interested in community and how people can engage with contemporary art practice.
And just to kind of emphasise what social practice art is, for us it's about placing the social at the heart of the work. So using conversation as a way to have dialogue and to really make meaning.
Arrivals and Departures is at Milton Keynes International Festival outside of Centre MK. And quite simply, it's an arrivals and a departure board, very similar to what you'd see in a train station. But we're inviting the public to submit names of people who have arrived, who have been born or who are still living, and those who have died, those who have departed on the boards. So it becomes a public artwork that is generated by the public and for the public, and thinks about ideas around memorial. Who do we commemorate? How do we commemorate them, and how can we create a work that gives the public agency?
Super easy to get a name up on the board. There's a website, arrivalsanddepartures.net, and all you need to do is go onto that website on your smartphone, or you can do it from home on your laptop. And then on the homepage there's a submission button, and you simply follow the process. It takes about 30 seconds and then your name will come up. We're super excited to see how the public, the people of Milton Keynes are going to engage with the work. We're imagining that people are going to be sharing names of people that they remember, that they want to actively remember, maybe who've died in the last year throughout COVID, or maybe who died 20 years ago. But also, we very much imagine people are going to be using the arrivals board as a way to celebrate new births. And in particular this last year, because of lockdown, people haven't had this sort of usual naming celebrations, etc., that one would normally have. So we're really imagining that's going to be used a lot too.
And we're really interested in inviting people here to use the boards in different ways. So it's been really exciting to see how, when the boards have been in different locations in London and New York and in Brighton, how people have activated the boards to think about the social, the global, the political in different ways. People have used the departures boards to name people, victims that have died in Gaza, to Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, to mark political movements, and to put on the arrivals board significant people, activists that have never been recognised, that are under-recognised. So it's a real space for people to use the boards in really different ways. So it's going to be really exciting to see how the public in Milton Keynes use these boards and subvert them and playfully engage with them. It's absolutely fantastic to be part of Milton Keynes International Festival. It's a real honour, and we're really looking forward to seeing the woodpecker work that opens and will be here for the duration.
So it's a pleasure for me to be here tonight with Yara and Elaine. As you've heard in the video, Yara El-Sherbini is half of the artist duo, Yara Davina, and they've created artworks for many world-leading art venues across the world, and their arrivals and departures has been toured internationally to London, New York, and you're going to Zurich next month. And Dr. Elaine Kasket, who is joining us online, is a renowned psychologist, writer, and public speaker. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, and her last book is titled All the Ghosts in the Machine, the Digital Afterlife of Your Personal Data. And here she argues that what happens to our data when we die is a perfect lens for reflecting on our modern condition and the power of big tech corporations. So it's great to be here with both of you. We are talking about ritualized departures. that's a particular interest for me. I'm a religious studies lecturer at the Open University. Of course, religious traditions are profoundly preoccupied with ideas and concepts relating to death, afterlife, the soul, death messengers, and so on. And what we've seen since the 1960s is a process of secularization or increased secularization. And this, there is no agreement here of how this is happening or if it is happening. Some scholars who say that, in fact, we are also experiencing a re-enchantment and religion is just changing its shape rather than disappearing. But it's really interesting to see what happens to ritual and funerary rites, through this lens. There are scholars like, in the beginning of the 20th century, like Arnold van Gennep, for instance, who understood funerary rites, death rites, as rites of passage, which are rituals that kind of help us transition. And they are similar to, let's say, birth rituals or, marriage rituals, puberty rites, and so on. And I think that death rituals are different from these rituals. They are quite unique, and in my mind, I'm a cultural theorist, and I think they're different because they are not about empowerment. Normally, rituals are about empowerment. And in this case, I think we have quite a unique ritual which is quite selfless, and in the center of the ritual space, this is this transitory being, the dead body, and the community really has a chance to say goodbye to it. In Romanian, I'm a British Romanian scholar, and in Romanian, the dead body is called mortu, which is, a kind of, I think, a good way of really focusing on this otherworldly, but not yet otherworldly being, transitionary being. And the second point, before I open up, our discussion, that I wanted to make was that I think what we can see in death rituals and funerary rites is a transition where perhaps we're moving away from the funeral rituals that were kind of more standardized and the domain of professionals in the 19th, end of 19th century, 20th century. And we are increasingly, people are, I think, reclaiming these. They're becoming a bit more personal. They're less culturally bound, and this is something we'll be talking about. They're more artistic. They're involving the family and the community, but in new ways, as we will see. One thing that if we have time, we can talk about, I obviously grew up in Romania in the 1980s, and this was, I experienced funerary rites in a very kind of close-up fashion. The dead person was looked after by the family. They were, washed, dressed, kept in the house. The wake lasted for 3 days and so on. So, that is a model of funerary rites that kind of interests me, because I think it's quite close to, traditional funerary rites, or what funeral rites used to be in the past. So the first question that I have here for us, or something to think about, and I think especially for Elaine, because this is your specialist area, do you think that online means less or more grief, and how do we cope with grief, in these strange times, how are online rituals, in a way, reshaping funerary rites?
The first question about less or more is an interesting one to me because of the very common assumption that it seems to contain that technology has a particular monolithic, perhaps, or tends to have a particular impact on grief in quantity or quality. And I think the thing that's worth emphasizing is that grief is an entirely idiosyncratic experience, unlike what many of us assume or have heard about stages of grief. grief experiences, there is no one grief experience. There is no one grief process. And it's extremely, not just situated with the bereaved person, but it's with the individual bereavement. It reflects the unique relationship that that person had with the bereaved. I was so fascinated a minute ago when you talked about it not being a transition that involves empowerment. But actually, bereavement is a process by which the individual bereaved person is empowered to narrate their version of the person that they lost and their relationship to them and themselves as grievers. And so what we're seeing in the online context is there's almost a kind of new death professional, or at least a person involved in death, entering the scene, which are the corporations or the figures within the corporations that manage our information when we're alive, or house or store our information when we're alive, whether that's email or social media platforms, whatever else. And they're taking decisions about what happens to these digital reflections and digital remains when people die. And there is some very profound disempowerment there, because people, they're saying, this is the form that digital remains are going to take. You know, they store it in this way. You can or cannot have access to it. You can or cannot look at it. This doesn't prevent bereaved individuals from still weaving that into their narratives of the bereaved and themselves as bereaved persons. But it's a very interesting development where people who aren't specifically death workers or funeral directors or whatever, being very, very involved in what happens to the digital body, which so many people have recourse to in continuing to feel connected to loved ones and ancestors. So there's a few really interesting dimensions in there that bear a lot of discussion.
Yeah, and I would have thought that, you know, my instinct would have been that, you know, that there's a kind of, you know, you're claiming some sort of freedom there with, you know, having, you know, being able to create a website for a loved one, or some sort of memorialization. You know, I suppose there are online cemeteries, aren't they, or online and, you know, and memorials and so on. But yes, of course, they have to be negotiated with, like you said, this other funeral director, the digital funeral director. That,
absolutely, because we don't really own much of the information that we commit to bodies on the internet. It's controlled by a third party, so we overestimate the amount of control that we have, and are oftentimes surprised. But technology contains a multitude of affordances. It gives you control with one hand and takes it away with the other. It allows for kind of individuation on one hand and freedom and creativity, and it deprives you of a certain amount of that on the other, when your information is not your own, or control of that is taken away from you, or access to that is lost. And so there is no monolithic impact. They can't really say more or less, because more or less than what? There is no grief norm, you know, to compare that to. And so I guess the more interesting question, you know, on an individual level is, you know, what story is this bereaved person creating of themselves and the deceased, and how are they weaving in the sort of digital aspect of it into that story, whether they have access to digital material or not.
That's fascinating.
And it's interesting, Elaine, because I know later on we'll probably hopefully go back to some of the larger environmental issues about data. But I think taking a step back, I think I was one of the people that when we were creating Arrivals and Departures in the early days of COVID, and we saw this inability to go to funerals, that I was one of those people that thought that technology was creating a limitation and a lack of that human experience. And one of the things that we found was happening is that people were going to the departure boards and putting up names of people and using that as a moment of togetherness, to grieve with other members of their family, just slightly highlighting the reality that people weren't able to gather at funerals and grieve in the way that we knew how. And we spoke before about this idea that for me it felt like it was limiting that, but actually something really brilliant I'd like you to expand on was this idea that technology, since, you know, in the last 18 months, hasn't limited. it has potentially really expanded the way that people can grieve and access these moments and these experiences. And also this idea, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about these hybrid models and niche practices that have existed and do exist that we didn't know about because we didn't need to know about. But since, you know, the limitations of people gathering, we're now realizing that things have been happening online and people have been actually finding ways to grieve, and it isn't necessarily a limitation. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about that idea of actually how technology cannot be seen as a limitation.
I think that when people are faced with a externally imposed reduction on their freedom or their range of choices, that's automatically experienced as a limitation in any case. And then, of course, we also have a discourse around technology that it's not real relating, or that it inevitably creates distance, or it inevitably creates some kind of not connecting, you know, in the proper way. And in reality, there's a range of experiences of that, which is as individual as individuals themselves. And I try to reorientate people because there is no monolithic impact, like, oh, it automatically creates distance or it automatically creates closeness. It's more about people approaching the technology and saying, well, it's important for me to connect. I want to gather. I want to honor this person. I want to do so in the company of people that, you know, also cared about the person, perhaps from around the world. How can technology be used in service of that? Even if you were able to gather physically co-present, there is no perfection in that. That does not remove the possibility of pain or difficulty or awkwardness. It does not mean that no one in that gathering will feel alone. It does not mean that no one in that gathering will feel marginalized. I'm sure we can think of plenty of problematic things like that for people at physically co-present gatherings. And there have been some extraordinary and beautiful examples of ceremonies and rituals that have been enacted in COVID times and before COVID times that involve connecting people using technology from across the globe. And these can be extremely connecting, but it's situated more in the attitudes and the behaviors and the willingness and the openness of the individuals involved. And then if that is approached with a curious and open mind and an intent to harness the connecting affordances of technology, there's a lot of possibility there that people deny themselves when they revert to kind of easier automatic assumptions that it will be less than.
Very interesting.
It is, and it's interesting because it ties into, again, something we were talking about this idea of the digital graveyard, I think you called it. I'm not sure exactly what term you just used.
I thought it was cemeteries, but
cemetery, sorry, a digital cemetery. This idea of sort of these sort of Facebook pages and these memorial sites that are being set up. That you were just talking about, this idea that there is this online space to mourn, to grieve, for the bereaved to tell their story and powerfully reenact their version. But this idea of coming back to this issue of how the digital companies that own this, how long does this, this site exist for? Where does this data last? And looking back at the idea that in traditional times, in ancient times, there was always a time-specific period. So if you look even as far back as ancient Egypt, there was 40 days that the soul remained on earth. There was a belief that it traveled to the afterlife, that there was a set period for this particular experience. And if you look back in many religions, this notion of 40 days and 40 nights to mourn and grieve is a very specific period. And I think that idea of having a time frame and a limit can be really useful and helpful. But it's interesting, Elaine, because I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that idea of something time specific in terms of data, because I think many of us don't really understand where data is held or what that means or what the environmental cost means. You think if a loved one passed away, I'd want to set up a Facebook page and I'd want to communicate that with that person, and I might want to do that for years and years, but what does that mean? We don't really understand what impact that has on us as well, to be able to continue to communicate.
That's right, and
Well, again,
prolong this
that's an
potentially.
individual matter as well, I suppose. When you talk about impact, again, it's not a monolithic question, but and oftentimes on Facebook, for example, or other social media, it's not so much a matter of setting something up. It's about transforming what was that person's in life presence, co-present with their community of friends, and it becoming a memorialized site and put into remembering status, so that there's a element retained of what that person's activity and presence was when they were alive in that place, and then a tribute tab that represents the ongoing memorialization process. So there's multiple ways to interact with that. But as you say, there's no parameters. It's kind of indefinite. We don't know. We kind of have an insecurity about, well, how long will this email account be open, or will somebody come along and close it? Will my friend's Instagram account disappear overnight without my being able to anticipate it? Well, even if someone on Facebook nominates a so-called legacy contact to look after it, if that legacy contact passes away or something happens to them, then what? So there's this kind of indefinite, who knows, persisting by default, the kind of quality of a lot of the data that people leave behind when they're gone. And there's no societal convention or legal parameters established yet as to, well, this is how long you could expect that person's digital reflection, digital remains to be in this place. So as you can imagine, in the digital age, when so much information is being captured and stored, it's just building up. And there's just an unfathomable amount of information online that often not very particularly sentimentally meaningful or practically useful, pertaining to people who are deceased, which, as you say, could have an environmental cost. It could have a security cost, because that information can still be connected to the data of the living and could be used as a conduit or a route to the data of the living. So there's this kind of open-ended quality to it that I think in many, many ways is neither helpful nor practical. And I fantasize or imagine a sort of scenario where there were limits placed on that, so that people had a certain amount of time to interact as they wish, including perhaps archiving or downloading that information that is meaningful to them before it's taken away. But then there's some historians who might argue differently, sort of saying, well, this is also an archive. This is an archive of human history, and what is the responsible thing to do about that? So there are other perspectives on this as well that don't have to do with individual grief per se.
Yes, and I wonder if that is changing the way, I suppose, because we are able to resurrect, all this digital data about the deceased. If we don't necessarily say goodbye in the same way as traditionally, you would say goodbye to the dead. And I know that in some cultures, for instance, you have a second burial where you exhume, the dead person, and you bury them again. You bury the bones, and that has the role of kind of, in some way, showing the family that it's time to move on. That happened 7 years after the death, and it's a way of kind of showing, now it's just these bones. It's very impersonal. They all look the same, and they go to the family crypt, or they kind of move on even further away from the family and the personal. So, but with this idea of kind of having digital data lingering on, and kind of keeping that person present for us for decades. I think that's really interesting. That these models that we have from traditional, cultural models of kind of dealing with this, as you said, like having that temporal frame of 40 days and 40 nights, and then the soul, kind of finally departs, and then you have the memorial, the 1 year memorial, the 7 years reburial, as you do, but not having these traditions. What does it mean for us?
Well, and of course that doesn't represent all global traditions either, although oftentimes there is the 40 days, 40 nights thing that you're referencing there. In some other cultures, There's a very strong ancestor culture where there are altars within the home, or where the ancestors' advice or succor is frequently sought, where the line between the living and the dead is more thin, where the ancestors are more constant presence rather than these periodic kind of resurrections and reburials or annual recognitions. So there's such a rich tapestry of conceptualizing how the dead fit into society. And in some ways, the automatic persistence of the information of the dead almost brings us more into kind of a culture of care rather than a culture of memory. I think that globally can almost break up attitudes towards the place of the dead in society. As a culture of memory, we honor them, we remember them, we recognize that they're gone, but we're not looking after them actively or in communication with them. Whereas a culture of care means that you're still sort of performing rituals or doing something to look after the ancestors, the spirits of the ancestors, that could be in service of keeping them happy so they don't come back and sort of haunt you like hungry ghosts who don't like to be forgotten. Or it could be in service of feeling like, well, the line between the living and the dead is thin, and they still very, very much feel present among us. So one of the things I do wonder is whether the persistence of the digital dead shifts us more towards a culture of care rather than a culture of memory, because of the vivid ways in which the dead are present and continue to be integrated in their social networks of which they were a part when they were alive.
Fascinating.
Well, especially it brings back this idea of the digital avatar and the conversations that may happen in the near future, where people continue to have conversations with people that have passed away in the hope that they can continue that relationship, which is, as you're saying, one of care. It's not one of memory and saying a goodbye. It's one of a continued relationship. And it's interesting because we spoke before, Elaine, and you were talking about this idea of to what end and to what purpose. And I'd love you to just expand on that, because I think I found that really fascinating, this idea that actually, why are we continuing to have these conversations?
Yes, and so there have been a few, well, I say well-known examples, but they might just be well-known to the people that I know. So kind of colleagues who are also in the death of the digital field, but there are a few that have made the news that some people might have heard of, and some recent headlines as well. One well-known example is an app, a chatbot app that was created by a Russian woman for Roman Mazurenko, her friend who passed away. He was an entrepreneur who passed away in his 20s, and anybody can download the Luca app and have a conversation with Roman based on his chat history that they fed the algorithm with when he was, or the chatbot with. There's somebody who made Dadbot. He collected a lot of material from his father prior to his father's death, and then created this bot representing his father. But Microsoft recently filed a patent in January of 2021 for creating chatbots of the dead. So this is interesting because there's this kind of fantasy within that you don't have to entirely find yourself without the person or endure the pain of not having somebody answer back, which I think is something it's hard to imagine, isn't it? When you're close with someone and you love them, and it's very hard to wrap your head around them not being there and not being able to get that response any longer. And so people think about these things and create these things thinking, oh, well, this is going to be something that I'm going to want, or that's going to be helpful to me in my grief. Whether they actually feel the same way when they get there, or whether the interaction with what's created has the effect that the person is looking for is, of course, open to question. It's for that individual to discover. But when I think about this being kind of proposed on a mass scale, or thinking, well, isn't it a good thing? Again, this sort of loops back to the initial question that you asked, the idea that technology can help people in their grief, and that maybe these chatbots or these, artificially intelligent avatars, which would be extremely kind of environmentally costly to create and to, maintain, that is going to reduce our upset, that it's going to be something to help us solve for grief. But that's really sort of treating grief as a problem to be solved. You know, this experience, this inevitable kind of human experience of loss and finitude, and kind of everything having its time in the sun and then going away. That's not a problem. But there's this technological utopianism almost that sort of says, oh, technology is going to create a situation where we don't have to feel pain, or we never have to wait for a bus, or everything is anticipated before we even know that we want it in this frictionless existence. But that frictionless existence, which might sound good, actually creates something with no light and shade, and with no topography, and no sort of like difficulty to make us realize, the kind of sweetness of the happiness or the, pleasure when we have it. And so, yeah, I think it appeals to people's fantasies of pain avoidance and grief avoidance. But, I'm not sure that any chatbot either can do that or needs to do that.
Yeah.
I do think the environmental factor is something I never would have thought about or known about, Elaine, if you hadn't told me about that idea of those chatbots using data, creating data, and these data farms. So it's really fascinating to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And talking about the environmental factor, I suppose there are many, funeral rituals that will have to be reconsidered from that perspective, because the funeral industry does not necessarily consider the environmental cost when it sells, it's very expensive, wooden caskets or whatever arrangements it makes for the dead, that seem comfortable, but of course this is, not a comfort that's needed. But yeah, so I suppose that there are many, and cremation is also environmentally costly as well. And of course, that's why in this new funerary rituals we have a kind of a search for environmentally, for green funerals and green rituals as well. So
green rituals, green burials, and I think that what we're realizing is that because data and information, our computers and our it seems so clean, doesn't it? It just it doesn't seem, we aren't actively conscious of the environmental cost of both the hardware that we use, the devices that we use, or the data. But when you think about the exponential increase in data that is captured and stored and created by, almost increasingly, almost every human on the planet, and then all of that data, it has to be stored and it produces heat and it has to be cooled. And so these data centers around the world, we have to think, okay, well, what data is important to keep and which ought we to jettison? But then when we think about that with respect to the data of the deceased, you have to think whose value judgments, according to what criteria do we decide which data is kept, whose data are kept, and which are lost? Does it then exacerbated existing inequalities whereby only the rich people who can afford to pay for it get their family's history or their own history preserved in the same way that some people would have massive monuments in cemetery in Père Lachaise, and other people would be buried in paupers' graves. So you have to think, okay, from a historical point of view, a justice point of view, whose data is granted the importance or the historical relevance to be preserved, and who's not, and why. So we have to think about these as not being neutral decisions either, and things that we have to think about very carefully. But it's not a good idea for it to just keep on compiling and kept ad infinitum. That would be absurd.
Yes, because there's this, I think, opinion shared by some that, in terms of having, a very costly funeral, or having, because of course, there's this idea of kind of giving somebody a good send-off and kind of spending a lot of money on the funeral, or, having, then that doesn't matter in a way, because it, it kind of counterbalances the fact that people will deal with the grief of the loved one's loss easier. So in a way, that's how that's explained. It's costly, but it's going to be I don't know, the bill for the for the therapy that I'd have to have, and the I don't know.
It's
all
really
the other,
it can be about status.
Yeah.
It can be about guilt. It can be about kind of like, your perception, your place in the community, the kind of doing right by, the kind of feeling that you need to do right by somebody. That's often a community-facing, sort of socially embedded sort of thing, like what kind of judgment might there be from either the community or by, if one believes in this, the deceased person, if I don't, so there's all sorts of complex social and psychological things that go in.
Yeah, of course, and status and so on.
Well, I think it's interesting, just as an aside, this idea that actually we do talk about the funeral business as a business, because ultimately people are trying, as you say, to present some, experience. But actually, if you look at and think about green burials and the Islamic tradition of wrapping the body in white, just literally in white cotton, there's no big expensive funeral experience. It's a really simple, humble experience that happens in a mosque. It's not £25,000 affair with a gorgeous wooden casket, because it's not needed. It's just this simple idea of ashes to ashes and dust to dust, earth to earth, and really a really simple moment of burial that isn't it isn't about it being extravagant. It's actually about being very humble. But actually, one of the things I wanted to touch on was something, again, we talked about, which is about changing rituals. And an experience, Maria, that I'd love you to talk about, which is this idea of communal mourning and the tradition of keening and wailing. In rural villages in Egypt, there was always somebody that was appointed to wail, and a daba, who was sort of somebody who was an appointed person to wail for everybody, where there was this outpouring of emotion and outpouring of grief that was very vocal and very loud. And in the Celtic tradition, keeners had a similar role. These were generally 3 women that were hired to be at a funeral, so they didn't necessarily know these people. They were often strangers, and they were there to help with this outpouring. And in the Celtic tradition of keening, they often believe that the vibrations of the wailing help the soul pass on. So this idea of actually a communal experience that often was triggered and started by the wailing of strangers to help the outpouring of people's own grief. And I know, Maria, you talked about in Romania, the cultural experiences that you yourself have experienced recently, and I'd love for you to share a bit about that, and then we'll bring that back onto online.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I think that it's surprising that these traditions have been preserved in Romania, and and like you said, so the wailing and kind of paying somebody not only to do that, not only to to kind of help with that expression, but like visit the grave as well. So these women would be paid for 40 days or for a longer period to just visit the grave and be part of that kind of community grief. But yes, I grew up with that in a way. I grew up with the dead person being in the house and being cared, being washed by the family, dressed, and all these objects that would help the person on their journey. They would be given all these objects, and they would be kind of ritually washed in a way, ritually washed with light. So you'd have people a kind of morning and night. You'd have people performing these rituals with light, and you'd have the priest come and visit as well. But there would be this family, these family rituals that would involve just the family in the immediate community, and of course they would be looked after for the entire time. So. The most recent one I've experienced was in 2015 when my sister-in-law died, and I had forgotten. I had lots of funerals in my. I had been at lots of funerals in my childhood, just because you'd go to everyone in your family, not only your immediate family, but your extended family and your community. But I've been here for so many years, and so I'd forgotten how it felt. And that's another aspect. Actually, I don't think we'll have time to talk about that. But it's really interesting for what happens to diasporas who can't be part of that kind of community grief anymore. But yes, I went to my sister-in-law's funeral, and suddenly I spent 3 days and 3 nights with my family, in this very small chapel, very small room. And she was beautiful. She was placed in a coffin, but it was summer, so it was like, she was like Snow White, because it was made of glass, and so it was a fridge, made of glass, to keep the body cold. And people came in and just talked to her, and we talked to her all the time. And it was a very strange experience to have that closeness and inclusion. And at the same time, there are all these beliefs about the dead body. That's why it's an ambivalent state, because on one hand you talk to them and you include them in your conversation, and on the other hand you are wary. And there are kind of all these protective rituals of don't turn your back, don't don't do that, because they are mortu, they are something else. They're not quite that person that used to be, but they are in a transitory state. And it's really interesting, it's fascinating, I think, to be part of that. And at the end of those 3 days, I didn't sleep at all, So there are people who kind of took turns to go and sleep and rest, and then they would come back, and I just couldn't, it was too, the whole thing was too dramatic. And of course, the grief that I was feeling as well. And so at the end of that, people were, truly able to celebrate. And I think that happens, elsewhere as well, even though we are not as close to death as it used to be. But, it was really strange at the end to be able to, I don't know, just breathe a sigh of relief and kind of feel joy. And I have this connection with her as somebody who's kind of joined that, line of ancestors in a way. So yeah, I could see the point in that, in that intense period of grief, rather than maybe having a more extended one. I'm not sure if that's how it works.
But I mean, I think, thank you for sharing, Maria. I think it's really wonderful to hear that. And I think for me, it's interesting about that idea I was coming back to, about that communal and feeling that kind of community and belief that we need to be together to mourn, but really actually saying, well, actually there are different ways to mourn. And I think one of the things I wanted to tie in was this idea of how this sort of traditional wailer, the person that was publicly grieving, can sort of be seen now in a way online. And Elaine, you were talking, and again, I'd like you just to expand on this idea that online people are outpouring their grief, and they also may be strangers.
Yes, there are several times there. And before I speak to that, I want to briefly speak to what I was thinking of, which I hadn't before when Maria was speaking, is that status, that liminal between two worlds status of the mortu. I think it has a lot in common with the digitally deceased person, because there they are, they're still in the same place or space, there's a vividness to them, but they're not active actors in the way they were, but yet people talk to them, and sometimes there are uncanny phenomena that make it feel as though the person can be talking back, especially in unmemorialized social media profiles, for example. It may behave in certain ways. And so in some ways, the digitally dead occupy this liminal space as well, which I find really fascinating. It's also going to be fascinating to see how technologically mediated kinds of rituals come to perhaps more actively include diaspora kind of communities, to kind of enabling them to kind of join in some kind of way, even when it's not physically co-present. But as you say, a phenomenon that's often called out or is viewed with distaste from some quarters is the public mourning or public sorrow expressed by people who didn't know a person personally in real life. And you see that sometimes with celebrity deaths. There are outpourings during that cluster of celebrity deaths in, I think, 2016 with David Bowie and Prince and Alan Rickman. There was a bit of a cluster there. And there were a lot of articles at that time about what is this, how dare people come on and express sorrow or pretend sorrow for somebody somebody that they didn't know. There's a certain amount of grief policing that goes on online, criticizing whether a particular individual deserves to experience or express sorrow given their status vis-a-vis the person who passed away. And that's super fascinating to me, because I'm wondering if that is largely a Western perspective or a perspective that comes from cultures where there isn't necessarily or haven't preserved the tradition of wailing or keening. Because I'm thinking, well, in cultures where that is a prominent part of the communities saying goodbye, or the person's being sent on their way, perhaps they would have less criticism of sorrow expressed online by strangers, because it would almost be enfolded into this idea of strangers, or even for pay keeners or wailers, performing a particular kind of ritual of ushering the person. But certainly there's no shortage of critiques, or saying, how dare you, you didn't know the person well enough to express yourself this way in this online forum. But it is a kind of keening, it is a kind of wailing, it is a kind of, and it's an acknowledgement that when somebody passes from this life, that it can be experienced in many ways, that a lot of people can relate to the significance of that person's passing, and they didn't necessarily know the person in life.
Well, I mean, you look back to let's say the olden days, and it was a community that came together. If somebody from a village died, it was a community that came together to mourn, whether they knew that person or not. So it comes back to that idea that you didn't have to know that person, but we can grieve as a community.
Yeah.
We can grieve more globally.
Yes, and of course also the nature of the digital environment, and thinking about people who can have an impact on us. There are, a particular blogger or a celebrity, or, just somebody far away that you might never have laid physical eyes on, may come to be a profound influence on your life, or you may communicate with them. There are very strong relationships forged. For example, I understand, I don't do this myself, in some of the gaming communities where people have avatars or spend a lot of time with one another online and they haven't met. But if one of those people passes away, the physical person behind the avatar passes away, that can be an event of real sorrow there for the people who never met them in the flesh, but who had forged some sort of meaningful relationship to them. And interestingly, sometimes those communities who also mourn the loss of that person's family might not know anything about those communities, even to kind of inform them of what has happened. So again, this is another example of how technologically mediated doesn't necessarily mean less close or less meaningful or less impactful.
We have some time to wrap up. We have about 10 minutes until the end. And I should say that for those people who are watching online, there is a possibility of asking questions, if they have questions for us and for Elaine in particular. They can type them in if they're watching it on YouTube or Facebook. We can...
Well, I do want to just say that I think it's really fascinating what you were just saying, Elaine, about this idea that people who are influenced in a different way now by different people in those relationships aren't necessarily like physical, tangible experiences, but actually when somebody passes in a public way, it's different from, let's say, a celebrity, but they might have had a physical impact on your life in ways that other people don't know, or even their family members do. I think that's absolutely fascinating, and I appreciate you sharing that. So we can wait a couple of minutes and see if anybody has any questions. We would invite any questions from the public if they want to ask us anything. If anything we've said sparked anything that they'd like to know more about, please, write in.
But it is fascinating, if I could just say, Yara and Maria, that in my line of work or interest or research, I know people who've been looking into or researching live streamed funerals or, kind of online memorials or whatever for years, and so these were established phenomena, but in a more niche or less common kind of way. And it's been so interesting to see the transformation of these phenomena from niche into extremely common because the circumstance demanded it. And it's worth reminding audiences, I suppose, that, you know, you know, it was the flu of 1918 transformed the death rituals of that time out of necessity. So it went from what we have always assumed to something quite new. And we're at that point again, almost exactly 100 years later. And that's an example of how funerary rituals never stay stagnant, but always keep changing.
Everything has to change, and I think actually hopefully this time will bring in new changes.
So we do have a question, and here it is. Online video games have been digitizing the dead and producing facsimiles as memorials for a while. There are at least 50 memorials of to dead players in World of Warcraft. That's extraordinary. Thinking of Dr. Nita's experience, will algorithmic chatbots be integrated to allow the deceased to talk back? And how would that disrupt the grief process? And at what point should that be shut down?
Well, there is no the grief process because, again, it's a highly individual sort of thing. So every person interacting with such a chatbot would forge their own relationship and experience their own reactions to it and presumably modify accordingly. And for some people, that might mean that that area of is no longer a comfortable place to be in that online space. They may choose to steer clear, or they may choose to participate. But I mean, if there's one thing that is a take-home message that I really want to help people understand is that point that I made, that there's no the grief process per se to disrupt. It isn't a problem unless it's a problem for an individual griever. That's something that's pretty important to remember so that we don't judge or worry about ourselves or others unnecessarily.
Brilliant. Well, I just want to end by saying that Davina and I are really passionate with Arrivals and Departures to engage a wider general public to think about life and death, to think about birth, to think about our journeys, to think about how we grieve and how that has changed and how we can look at birth, life, death, and everything in between in more accessible ways. So as we've said, if you're around in Milton Keynes, the work is available to be seen until the 28th of June. After that, it's heading to Zurich. You can engage. In July, sorry. You can engage with the work online at arrivalsanddepartures.net, and I really encourage you to, because you'll see some other podcasts on the website. You can submit a name, you can submit a story, you can talk about someone that's been born, that exists, that has just died, that has passed away 20 years ago or 100 years ago or yesterday. You can use it as a space to talk, and this entire public program really is about bringing together experts like you, Dr. Elaine, and you, Dr. Maria, to think and talk about and look at how the rituals around death are changing as times are changing, and specifically in the last 18 months. But like you talked about the Spanish flu, the way people grieve always changes, life changes, and I hope that this artwork is creating a space for people to come together and have discussions and debates and think and talk about these really important moments, these rites of passages in our life. And I really appreciate that you're both here to share this conversation tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking
And of course, thank you to the Milton Keynes International Festival, and particularly Bill G. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Good night.